I kept them safe. I kept my word. And for 6 years, that was enough. My name is Raymond. I'm 64 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house on the edge of Clarksburg, West Virginia, with a garden out back that my late wife planted 30 years ago and that I've been too stubborn to let die. I drive a 2009 Ford F-150 that needs a new alternator. I make my own coffee every morning at 5:15. These are the things that have stayed the same. Everything else changed on a Tuesday in March when my son dropped off my 2 grandchildren with a duffel bag and a box of cereal and told me he'd be back by Sunday. That was 6 years ago. I didn't plan to raise 2 kids at 60. Nobody plans that. You picture retirement differently. Maybe some fishing, maybe finally fixing the back fence, maybe sleeping past 6. You don't picture a 7-year-old girl crawling into your bed at 2 in the morning because she had a nightmare, or a 9-year-old boy who stops talking for 3 weeks after his dad disappears and you don't know how to reach him. You figure it out. You have to. Let me back up. My son, I'll call him by what he was to those kids, which is their father, was never steady, not even as a boy. He had charm the way some people have weather, unpredictable and sometimes beautiful, and usually followed by damage. His mother loved him fiercely and worried about him constantly and was gone before she got to see how things turned out. She passed when the kids were small. Breast cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I still reach for the phone sometimes to tell her things. After she died, my son got worse. He'd been doing well for a couple of years, kept a job at a logistics company in Charleston, had his own apartment, was present for his kids in the way you hope a father will be. Then he fell in with a woman who had money and problems in equal measure, and the 2 of them fed each other's worst instincts. I watched it happen slowly and then all at once. I tried talking to him 3, 4 times. He'd listen with that expression men get when they're only waiting for you to stop speaking. Once he told me I didn't understand modern relationships. Once he told me I was lonely and projecting. I drove home both times and sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. The Tuesday he brought the kids over. He looked thin. He had a restless energy I'd seen before, the kind that means something is chasing a person. He kissed my granddaughter on the top of her head and told my grandson to be good. He shook my hand, which he almost never did. It felt like a goodbye, and I told myself I was being dramatic. The duffel bag had 4 days of clothes in it. The cereal was the kind with the marshmallows. He drove away and I stood on the porch and watched his daylights disappear, and my granddaughter, who was 7 and sharper than anyone gave her credit for, looked up at me and said, "He's not coming back Sunday, is he?" I said I wasn't sure. She nodded like she'd already done the math on this and was just confirming it. Then she went inside and turned on the television. Sunday came. Then the following Sunday. Then a month passed, and my phone calls started going to voicemail, and I filed the missing persons report, and nothing came of it, and I enrolled the kids in the local school, and opened a joint account at Mountain Valley Bank to manage expenses and called a family law attorney named Harold. Cole was a friend of a friend who helped me establish emergency guardianship. It wasn't complicated. There was no one else. I want to be honest about those early years because I've heard people talk about raising grandchildren like it's a second chance at something beautiful, and it is sometimes, but it's also just hard in the ordinary grinding way that parenting is hard. My granddaughter, I'll call her by what she was to me, which is my girl, went through a phase around age 9 where she tested every single boundary I put in front of her, not maliciously. She was working something out. I understood that. But understanding it didn't make it easy to be patient at 10:30 on a school night when we were arguing about whether homework was optional. My grandson was quieter about his grief, and I think in some ways that was harder to watch. He channeled it into baseball. By 12, he was the best pitcher in his age group in the county. He'd practice in the backyard until the light was completely gone, and I'd stand at the kitchen window watching him and thinking about his father and missing my wife and feeling something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite pride, but was somewhere between the two. I worked. I had a pension from 30 years at the county assessor's office, and I picked up part-time work doing bookkeeping for a small hardware chain to cover the extra expenses. It wasn't comfortable, but it was manageable. We ate well. We took a road trip every summer, once to the Outer Banks, once to Gettysburg, once all the way to Nashville. I wanted them to have memories that weren't defined by what had been taken from them. My neighbor across the street, I'll call him Pete, became something I hadn't expected. We'd been cordial before, the kind of neighborly that means you wave and you help each other when there's a bad storm, but not much more than that. After the kids came to stay, Pete started showing up in useful ways. He'd take my grandson to hardware stores on weekends because they both liked tools and neither of them liked talking much. He drove my girl to her school play practice twice a week for a year because I had a scheduling conflict on Tuesdays. He never made a big deal of any of it. He was just there, in the background, the way good people often are, quietly making things possible. I should tell you about the day my son came back, because nothing that came later makes sense without it. It was a Wednesday in October, 6 years after he'd left. My girl was 13. My grandson was 15. They were both at school. I was in the backyard, pulling up the last of the tomato plants when I heard a car in the driveway. He looked different. Not worse, exactly. He'd put weight back on. The hollowed look was gone. He was dressed well. He had a woman with him, someone I didn't recognize, who stayed by the car with her arms crossed and didn't introduce herself. He said he'd gotten his life together. He said he'd been through a program. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been through a program. He said he was sorry. He said he wanted his kids back. I stood there with dirt on my gloves and I tried to figure out what I felt. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't relief. It wasn't anger either, not exactly. It was something more like the feeling you get when you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time, and someone tells you you can put it down, and your first response isn't gratitude. Your first response is that your arms don't know how to straighten. I told him the kids were in school. I told him we should all sit down together, that he should meet them where they were, that we needed to take this slowly. I told him I was glad he was alive. He said he'd think about it. He drove away. The woman never turned around. I called Harold that evening. I told him what happened and asked what my rights were. He said emergency guardianship was solid, especially after 6 years, but that a biological parent returning and demonstrating stability could complicate things. He said to keep records of everything. I already was. I had a filing cabinet with 6 years of school records, medical records, tax filings, report cards, church bulletins with their names in the programs. I had receipts going back to the beginning. I wasn't sure what I was protecting against, but I'd learned from 30 years of public records work that documentation is the difference between having a story and being able to prove one. 2 months later, I got a certified letter. It was from a law firm in Charleston. The language was formal and dense, but the meaning was simple. My son was petitioning for full custody of both children, alleging that I had interfered with his parental rights and that my guardianship had been obtained improperly. The letter used phrases like unauthorized retention and deliberate obstruction of family reunification. It accused me of alienating the children from their father. I sat at the kitchen table and read it 3 times. Then I put it face down and made dinner because my grandchildren were going to be home in 40 minutes and they didn't need to see me frightened. I was frightened, not of losing in court exactly. I had records. I had Harold. I had 6 years of proof. What frightened me was what this would do to the kids. My grandson was 15 and finally slowly building something like peace with what had happened. My girl was 13 and had the kind of ferocity about her life that I recognized. The way you fight for something you know can be taken. I didn't want this legal machinery dropped into the middle of what they were building. I talked to them that weekend. I sat them both down on a Saturday morning. Pancakes first, because some conversations require preparation, and I told them what was in the letter. I told them clearly and without editorializing. My grandson asked 2 questions, both practical. My girl was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What do you need from us?" I told her I needed them to talk to Harold, that a judge might want to hear from them. She said, "Okay." My grandson said, "Okay." Then he asked if there was more bacon. I loved them so much in that moment I could barely speak. The weeks that followed were the worst kind of waiting. There's a particular stress in legal proceedings that isn't like any other kind. It sits in the body differently. I'd wake up at 4 in the morning and just be awake, my mind running through scenarios. I started going to my church more regularly, not because my faith was especially strong, but because sitting in that building with the same people who had watched me show up week after week for 30 years was steadying. Pete noticed. He asked one evening when he came over to return a drill if everything was okay. I told him about the lawsuit. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know I'll say whatever needs to be said." I told him I might take him up on that. He said, "That's what I'm saying." Here's what I didn't know at the time. What I didn't find out until later, my son had been coached. The woman who'd been with him that October day, who I eventually learned was not a girlfriend but a legal consultant of some kind, someone his new girlfriend had connections to, had advised him that the guardianship was vulnerable because I'd never formalized it beyond the emergency order. I'd tried. Harold had told me the circumstances made it complicated to push for permanent guardianship without the biological parent's consent or termination of parental rights, and without evidence of abuse or abandonment that would hold up to a sustained challenge. We were in a holding pattern. I'd taken his advice. I'd stayed in the holding pattern. That had been a mistake. I owned that. The day of the preliminary hearing, I wore the same suit I'd worn to my wife's funeral and then to both kids' school concerts. It seemed right. I sat next to Harold in a courthouse in Charleston and watched my son sit across the room with 2 attorneys and tried not to assign meaning to the fact that he wouldn't look at me. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Clara Webb. She was efficient and unhurried at the same time, the way good judges are. She asked both sides to present their basic position. My son's attorneys talked about rehabilitation and parental rights and the importance of biological family. Harold talked about continuity of care, 6 years of documented stable provision, and the children's own expressed wishes. Then Judge Webb said she wanted to speak with the children. I had known this might happen. Harold had prepared them, but there's a difference between preparing for something and it happening. And I watched my grandson walk into that conference room, taller than me now, his mother's eyes. And I thought about the 9-year-old who had stopped talking for 3 weeks, and I had to look away for a moment. They were in there for 40 minutes each. When my girl came out, her expression was unreadable. She sat next to me and put her hand over mine on the table without saying anything. The judge recessed until the following week. I drove home. I made dinner. I did not sleep well. What happened next I almost didn't find out until it was too late. Pete called me on a Thursday morning, 4 days before the continuation of the hearing. His voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. He said he needed to come over. I said of course. He sat down at my kitchen table and told me that the evening before, one of my son's attorneys, a younger man, not the lead, had come to his door. Had asked Pete to be a character witness, had presented it as a formality, neighborly support. And then Pete said, the man had asked if Pete would be willing to remember certain things in a particular way, specifically that he had witnessed me speak disparagingly about my son in front of the children. that I had made comments suggesting their father was dangerous or unfit. None of that had happened. Pete told the attorney that. The attorney had smiled and said memory was a funny thing. Pete said he left me his card. He suggested I think it over. I stared at Pete for a long time. Then I asked if the attorney had said anything else. Pete said yes, that there had been a comment, casual, almost in passing, about how property values in our neighborhood had been improving and how a man with a fixed income might find that helpful to know. That was not a coincidence. That was a suggestion. I called Harold immediately. I told him everything. He was quiet for several seconds and then he said, "Did Pete keep the card?" Pete had the card. Harold said, "Can Pete come to my office today?" He could. What happened over the next 72 hours was the kind of methodical, unglamorous work that actually changes outcomes. Harold filed a motion with the court. Pete gave a sworn statement. Harold's office made contact with the West Virginia State Bar to report what had occurred. The lead attorney on my son's team, I believe he was genuinely unaware of what his associate had done, responded in a way that suggested he was as alarmed as anyone. The associate attorney was quietly removed from the case. I did not feel victorious about this. I felt tired. The morning of the continuation hearing, my grandson asked me at breakfast if I was okay. I told him I was getting there. He nodded and poured his cereal and said, "You know, we already said what we needed to say to the judge, right? We said it clearly." I asked him what he meant. He said, "We told her where we live. That's all that matters." He was 15 years old. His father's eyes, his mother's soul, and something entirely his own. In the courtroom, Judge Webb wasted very little time. She noted that a matter had come to her attention regarding witness contact and that it had been appropriately referred for review. She said this did not automatically determine the custody question, but that the court took the integrity of its proceedings seriously. Then she spoke about the children. She said that in her career she had sat with a great many minors in circumstances like this, and that the clearest indicator of well-being was not biological connection, not financial stability, not any single factor in isolation, but consistency and the quality of attachment that consistency made possible. She said she had spoken at length with both children and that they had been articulate and direct about their wishes and their reasons. She awarded me permanent legal guardianship. She also said, and I want to be precise about this because it mattered to me, she said that nothing in her ruling was intended to permanently foreclose a relationship between the children and their biological father, and that she expected all parties to approach any future contact with the children's well-being as the primary consideration. She looked at my son when she said it. He looked at the table. Outside the courthouse, Harold shook my hand and told me I should go home and rest. I told him I would. I didn't, immediately. I sat on a bench outside and called Pete and told him how it went. He said good. That was all, just good. I called my daughter-in-law, my late wife's sister, who had been my quiet support through all of this, and she cried, and I let her, and then I cried a little too, the kind of crying that has more relief in it than grief. Then I drove home to Clarksburg. My grandchildren were at school. The house was quiet. I walked through it the way you walk through a place when you need to remember it. The kitchen where we'd had 1,000 breakfasts, the living room where we'd watched every Super Bowl for 6 years and argued about teams, the hallway where I'd marked their heights on the door frame with a pencil every birthday because my wife had done that for their father and I wanted to keep something going. I went out back and looked at the garden. There are things that don't resolve cleanly. My son and I have spoken twice since that day in the courthouse. It's civil and it's careful, and I don't know yet what it will become. My grandson asked me once if I hated his father. I told him honestly no, that I was angry and that I was sad for him, and that those things could coexist with love. because love is not the same as approval, and it doesn't require the other person to deserve it. He thought about that for a while. He said it sounded exhausting. I said it was. Pete had dinner with us the following Friday. My girl made her grandmother's cornbread recipe, the one I'd written out for her on an index card 2 years ago. She'd gotten it exactly right. Pete had 2 pieces and didn't say anything about it, and then said, very quietly, that it was the best cornbread he'd had since 1987. My girl looked like she'd won something. I didn't give Pete money. I want to be clear about that because I think people sometimes assume that's how loyalty gets settled. I offered. He refused with language that made the subject feel closed. What I did was spend 6 Saturdays helping him rebuild the deck on the back of his house, which had been rotting for 2 years and which he'd been putting off. We worked in the mornings and had lunch together and didn't talk much, and that was its own kind of acknowledgement. Some things don't translate into dollars and shouldn't try. My grandson pitched a shutout in the district semifinals last spring. I was there in the 3rd row in a folding chair with a thermos of coffee, and at the end of the game when his teammates came off the field, he looked up into the stands first and found me. That's all. He just looked up and found me. My girl has started talking about college. She wants to study environmental law. She has opinions about everything, and she's usually right, and she doesn't mind telling you so. She reminds me of her grandmother in ways that catch me off guard sometimes. The same quickness, the same willingness to say the hard thing if it needs saying. I told her that once. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "I'll take that." I'm 64 years old. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Clarksburg, West Virginia, and my back has opinions about winter mornings, and I still make my coffee at 5:15, and the Ford needs that alternator. None of that has changed, but I kept my word. I kept them safe. I kept the height marks on the doorframe. That was always going to be enough. I've had a lot of time to think about why things happened the way they did, not in a bitter way. I'm past that. But when you're 64 and you've been through something like this, you start to see the shape of it more clearly than you could in the middle of it. My son made choices, small ones at first, then larger ones, then the kind that have weight and consequence and don't just affect you. They ripple out. They land on a 7-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy who didn't ask for any of it. That's not judgment. That's just what happens when a person keeps choosing the easier thing over the right thing. Eventually, the distance between where they are and where they should be becomes very hard to cross. And I made choices too. I chose to be there when no one else was. I chose to file the paperwork, keep the records, show up to every school event and every doctor's appointment and every baseball game in the cold. I chose to tell the truth to a judge even when I was frightened about what the truth alone might not be enough to do. None of those choices felt heroic at the time. They felt like Tuesday. They felt like what you do when 2 kids are depending on you and there isn't anyone else. What I've come to believe, and I don't say this lightly, is that character is not something you declare. It's something you demonstrate slowly over time in the accumulation of ordinary decisions that nobody is watching. Pete didn't help me because there was anything in it for him. He helped because that's who he had been his whole life, quietly, without announcement, and when the moment came that required something real from him, he didn't have to decide what kind of person he was. He already knew. That's what I want my grandchildren to understand more than anything else. Not that they were wronged. They know that already. Not that they survived something hard. They know that too. What I want them to carry forward is this: the kind of person you become in the small moments is the person you will be in the large ones. There is no switch. There is no version of yourself you can reach for in a crisis that you haven't already been building in the ordinary days. My grandson already understands this. I see it in how he treats the younger kids on his team. I see it in how he was with his sister during the worst weeks of the hearing. Steady and matter of fact, not making it bigger than it was, but not pretending it was fine either. That's wisdom. He didn't learn it from a book. My girl is going to change things. I believe that with everything I have. She has a mind that doesn't let injustice settle, and she has enough hard experience now to know what injustice actually looks like. Not the abstract version, but the real one that shows up with certified letters and borrowed attorneys and people who bet that you won't be able to fight back. She'll know how to fight back. She already does. I kept the filing cabinet. I kept records. I kept my word. Those three things, honesty, discipline, and the refusal to quit, are the only inheritance I have to give. Everything else can be taken. Those can't.